Welcome to I Got Stuck, a catalog of temporary obsessions, with me, your host, Dr. Kelly Reedy, wherein each week I'll give you a full report on the latest topic that's kept me up at night. Things that have led to countless hours of procrastination through Googling, asking Jeeves, and navigating the twistiest and turniest of internet rabbit holes. By the way, rabbits can turn their ears a full 180 degrees. Today's topic is one that has literally kept me up at night many nights, because I often indulge in it too late in the day. It's very, very close to my heart and my mouth and my gut and my adenosine receptors. And of course, I'm talking about coffee. Coffee is the second most traded commodity in the world, second only to petroleum. And it is the preferred morning beverage for the majority of Americans. This is thanks to the Boston Tea Party, of course. And John Adams even went on to write a letter to his wife saying that tea was a traitor's drink. To be clear, that's traitor as in Benedict Arnold, not traitor as in Joe. Tea was overall snubbed by early Americans, and when the U.S. was officially formed, coffee was the patriotic drink of choice. But this isn't about tea versus coffee. For the record, I like them both, but I like coffee way more. I usually drink it black, which sounds simple, but coffee is a surprisingly complex beverage. You know how people say you can taste a bunch of different flavors in wine? Here are some fun ones from Wine Folly. We've got flamboyant, oaked, bright, toasty, charcoal, and even laser-like. Wine is a thing that people like to describe, and these flavors are scientifically quantifiable. Turns out that wine, at its most complex, will have around 250 molecular compounds that contribute to the smell and taste. Coffee, on the other hand, can have over 800 of these compounds. So there's a lot going on in coffee. It's much more complex than wine in that way, and it is one of the most complex beverages in the world. The sensory profile of a cup of coffee depends on a lot of factors. Some kind of obvious ones, like the type of coffee beans, where they're from, the roasting method, and how the coffee is brewed, but also some less obvious factors, like the size of the sip that you take. Apparently, bigger sips of coffee generate a stronger release of aroma than smaller sips do, which is bad news for a small sipper such as myself. Not only is it really complex, even for small sippers, but it's been around for a really long time. There's a lot of unknown and disputed stuff involved in the history of coffee, especially when it comes to its origins. So keep that in mind while you listen. But before I even get into the history, the first thing you need to know is about coffee beans. How does a coffee bean get to work? It takes the espresso lane. Okay, but seriously, what you need to know, in case you don't know already, is that coffee beans are not beans. We only call them beans because of a very complicated and scientific fact about them, and that is that they look like beans. Instead, they're actually seeds from inside the berries of the plant and plants in its family. Coffee beans/seeds come from the Coffea family of plants, and that is actually a family of trees. There are a bunch of different species of this tree, but the one most commonly used for our coffee today is the Coffea arabica tree. Normally, you hear about coffee bushes or coffee shrubs if you hear about these plants at all, but they're trees, so why call them bushes? Turns out that most coffee trees will grow pretty tall, like up to 40 feet, if they're left to their own devices. However, clever humans have learned that it's way easier to collect the so-called beans if the trees are more shrub-sized. So humans have learned to cultivate bush-sized coffee trees. They're kind of like bonsai coffee trees. Here's how it works. Berries grow on coffee plants, and they become bright red when they're ready to be picked. And by the way, they grow alongside lovely flowers that people say smell like jasmine. So people pick the berries, and then they remove the seed from the inside of each one. That's how it works. Now, I think you're ready for the history. Here we go. It's likely that the first drink made from coffee berries was in Yemen in the 1500s. And it was good, and people liked it. but there was one problem. Remember that inside coffee berries, there are coffee plant seeds. So the people selling these berries for drinks realized that they'd be out of a job pretty fast if they continued to sell seeds. The solution to this problem came out of Persia. Persian farmers were the first to realize that you can't grow a plant from a roasted seed. So they roasted them to safeguard the plant itself from being stolen. And the roasting of the beans turned out to taste pretty good. But how do we know about these little wonders that are coffee berries in the first place? People generally agree that coffee originated in Ethiopia, but nobody seems totally sure about who, how, or when. So I've picked my favorite of the coffee origin stories to tell you. This is the story of Kaldi the goat herd, and this version of the story takes place around 850 AD in Ethiopia. Legend goes that Kaldi the goat herd noticed that his goats were acting crazy and jumping all over the place like little maniacs. So he started to watch them more carefully, and he noticed that they were eating some berries that were growing nearby. Naturally, he wanted to try them too, so he did, and he had a great time, and he wanted to spread the good news. So he told his friend, who was a monk, about his discovery. The monk wanted to try it, so he made what was essentially a coffee berry tea. And it was amazing. After that monk drank the coffee berry tea, he found that he could stay up all night studying and praying and doing whatever else monks do. He shared this with his fellow monks, and then the knowledge of this new energizing drink began to spread further, and the rest is history. And I'll get back to that history in a minute. But first, I want to take a break from the timeline to talk about a few coffee enthusiasts. All-time coffee enthusiast number 1 was French writer Honoré de Balzac. He loved coffee so much that he wrote a very detailed essay on it called The Pleasure and Pains of Coffee. I want you to take a second to think about what you would say if you were writing an essay about drinking coffee, specifically starting the moment you swallow the coffee. How might you describe that? I'll give you a second. Here's what Balzac had to say about drinking coffee. This coffee falls into your stomach, and straight away there is a general commotion. Ideas begin to move like the battalions of the grand army of the battlefield, and the battle takes place. Things remembered arrive at full gallop, ensuing to the wind. The light cavalry of comparisons deliver a magnificent deploying charge. The artillery of logic hurry up with their train and ammunition. The shafts of wit start up like sharpshooters. Similes arise. The paper is covered with ink. For the struggle commences and is concluded with torrents of black water, just as a battle with powder. Took the words right out of my mouth. According to internet lore, Balzac used to drink 50 cups of coffee per day. Is that actually true? How big were these cups? And just how did Balzac die? The best account of all this that I could find online is from a website called airshipdaily.com. The author did a pretty thorough investigation as to where that claim originally came from and whether it's possible or not. It's a really long article, so I'm going to give you the important highlights here. First of all, it said that Balzac probably didn't drink 50 cups of coffee per day. I choose to live in denial, though, and assume that he did. Here's the evidence they give for saying that he did not drink 50 cups of coffee per day. Number 1, there doesn't seem to be any record of him drinking 50 cups of coffee a day in any legitimate source. And number 2, Balzac knew about the dark side of too much coffee. He wrote the following about the nastiness of drinking too much coffee. You will fall into horrible sweats, suffer feebleness of the nerves, and undergo episodes of severe drowsiness. I don't know what would happen if you kept at it then. A sensible nature counseled me to stop at this point, seeing that immediate death was not otherwise my fate. But okay, whether or not he drank 50 cups of coffee per day, how would a cup be defined? Maybe his cups were only an ounce or two each, like espresso-sized. Still, with 50 of those, between 50 and 100 ounces of coffee is a lot of coffee. That's a lot of any sort of liquid, in my professional opinion. And here's his daily routine. I go to bed at 6 or 7 in the evening, like the chickens. I'm waked at 1 o'clock in the morning and I work until 8. At 8, I sleep again for an hour and a half. Then I take a little something, a cup of black coffee, and go back into my harness until 4. I receive guests, I take a bath, and I go out. And after dinner, I go to bed. I want to know more about his harness personally, but that's some research for another day. One of his biographers did a calculation and determined that over the course of his life, Balzac probably drank around 50,000 cups of coffee. And he wasn't alone in this. One other coffee enthusiast who supposedly drank 50 cups per day was Voltaire. Voltaire was a pen name, by the way. His real name was François-Marie Arouet, but he changed it to rebel against his dad. Here's how Voltaire felt about coffee. I have only ever known one way to live, to make the most of the present moment by savoring it, and to never let it go without extracting every ounce of pleasure from it. Coffee is my companion in this pursuit. Another well-known coffee fan is David Lynch, who famously said, "Even bad coffee is better than no coffee at all." I agree. He was interviewed by a Vice reporter about his long-standing and well-known love of coffee, and I want to share a tiny little excerpt from that interview. I've heard that you used to be a lot like Balzac and drink 20 cups a day. How many do you consume these days? Well, I think I would say 10. It's true I used to drink 20, but they were smaller and in styrofoam cups. Now I drink them in bigger cups. The interviewer then goes on to say that she starts to feel shaky, etc. after 2 cups, and he replies, "I really enjoy them. I just keep drinking. My trick, though, is to stop drinking them around 5:30 at night." There you have it. Stop at 5:30, according to David Lynch. He's currently 78 years old and seems to be doing fine. Knock on wood. Quick note, though. Science tells us that caffeine has a half-life of around 6 hours, so keep that in mind when you plan your bedtime. Back to Balzac. That has a nice ring to it. He didn't have the longevity of David Lynch, and he died at age 51. His official cause of death was gangrene caused by congestive heart failure. In other words, long, slow caffeine poisoning. It makes sense if he was really drinking 50 cups per day. But should regular coffee drinkers worry about drinking too much coffee? How much is too much? Reports are all over the place. There never seems to be a consensus on that. And also, I love coffee too much to risk reading something that makes me scared of it. I did, however, read about one pretty great but quite unscientific experiment done on how coffee affects the human body. For this, we go to Sweden. But actually, hold on. We need to go even further back in time to get the lay of the coffee land. I've already told you about Kaldi in Ethiopia around 850 AD, who, according to legend, discovered coffee by being curious about what kinds of drugs his goats were getting into. There's a whole set of stories that have coffee originating in Yemen, and whether or not it actually originated in Ethiopia, its early days in Yemen were really important as a starting point to get where we are today in terms of coffee. Regarding other origin stories, there's a similar legend to the Kaldi one about a Sufi mystic in Yemen who noticed that some birds were acting a little hyped up, and he started watching them and saw that they were eating berries, so he tried to. Yet another version involves Omar the Sheikh, who was in exile from his home in Yemen and was living in a cave in the desert. He was really hungry, and he came across some berries, and they were gross. So he cooked them over the fire, and then they were gross and hard. Then he decided to try another step, and he boiled them in water. And it smelled good, so he tasted it one last time, and this time it was not too bad. He then bravely returned to his home with this new discovery/invention, and they loved it. It was so good that they let him return from exile for good to his hometown of Mocha. In general, coffee was hugely popular with Sufi mystics, as well as with Muslims. The origins are very much Arabian. These groups loved it because it was a little bit consciousness-altering, but wasn't fully ruled out by their religious beliefs and practices, nor by their governments. Not yet, at least. It was a little bit of a loophole. Until Coffee started getting people fired up and helping them have ideas about overthrowing governments and stuff like that. Pretty much since the very early days of coffee, people have loved it, and tyrants have hated it. It has this tradition of fueling intellectualism and uprisings and things that tyrants generally just don't like. One leader worth noting is Sultan Murad IV of the Ottoman Empire, 17th century. He beheaded anybody he caught drinking coffee. He used to walk the streets with a 100-pound sword looking for coffee drinkers to behead right there on the spot. And he would sometimes even wear a disguise. Life of the party, that guy. Meanwhile, in 17th century England, King Charles II ordered all coffee houses to be closed. But people were so mad about it that Charles feared for his life, changed his mind, and let them reopen again after only 11 days. Pope Clement VIII, however, was a better sport, and he actually endorsed coffee in 1600, saying, "This Satan's drink is so delicious that it would be a pity to let the infidels have exclusive use of it." And, "This devil's drink is so delicious, we should cheat the devil by baptizing it." Since then, coffee is sometimes referred to as the devil's drink or the devil's cup. A lot of people say that coffee spread as widely as it did because of this particular endorsement from the Pope. But in countries that were not Catholic, it still wasn't totally okay to drink coffee. Coffee house culture was kicking off in Europe around this time, the mid-1600s. And again, some people were really unhappy about this. In London, women supposedly got so riled up about the newfangled, abominable, heathenish liquor called coffee that they wrote a pamphlet about it, specifically about the supposed impotence caused by coffee. This pamphlet was called The Women's Petition Against Coffee, representing to public consideration the grand inconveniencies accruing to their sex from the excessive use of that drying, enfeebling liquor. It included passages like this one. "For can any woman of sense or spirit endure with patience that when she approaches the nuptial bed expecting a man that should answer the vigor of her flames, she on the contrary should only meet a bed full of bones and hug a meager, useless corpse?" And passages like this one. "Certainly our countrymen's palates are become as fantastical as their brains. How else is it possible they should trifle away their time, scald their chops, and spend their money, all for a little base, black, thick, nasty, bitter, stinking, nauseous puddle water?" Whew. However, many historians think this was all a conspiracy, and women didn't write that. They say it was written by people who wanted coffee houses to lose popularity because coffee houses were trouble. They were like bars, places where people would gather to discuss politics and the main events of the day. But the important difference is that at bars, people would get drunk and distracted and silly, but at coffee shops, they'd get sharper and smarter and quicker. Governments started to worry about the intellectual discourse going on in coffee houses. So some say that this campaign was a way to cool that culture down. Did it work? Of course not, but it's definitely funny. Remember that I started talking about coffee bans to tell you about that very unscientific coffee experiment that took place in Sweden. Let's get back to that. In 1746, the Swedish government was very anti-coffee, and they put a huge tax on both coffee and tea, so a black market for coffee and tea developed. Then the government went a step further and started confiscating any mugs that were found. 10 years later, Sweden officially banned coffee, then unbanned coffee, then banned coffee, then unbanned coffee, then banned coffee, then unbanned coffee. I think I got them all. And then Gustav III became king in 1771. Gustav tried a more crafty approach to the problem. He wanted to show people that coffee was poison. His plan was to publicly do an experiment on a set of identical twins that had been convicted of murder, which, side note, is a thing that I would love to know more about. These twins were meant to be executed after their murder convictions, but Gustav said, wait, hold on, these guys might be of better use to me alive, as research subjects in what is now considered by some to be the first clinical trial in Sweden's history. That's a joke, but only sort of. This was the premise of the experiment. Every single day for the rest of their lives, one brother would drink 3 pots of tea and the other would drink 3 pots of coffee. The king's hypothesis was that both brothers would die pretty quickly, and people would then see how bad coffee and tea were, and they would stop drinking them. But of course, that totally backfired. Gustav had hired a doctor to oversee the whole thing, to make sure they were drinking how much they were supposed to, and to keep track of their health. The first person to die in the experiment was the doctor. And by the way, some versions of the story say there were 2 doctors. The next person to die in this experiment, King Gustav III. And the next person to die in this experiment was the tea drinker, who lived to be 83 years old, which is no small feat during this time period. And lastly, the coffee drinker. Maybe? There's actually no record of his death. He lived so long that nobody cared about the experiment anymore, and so nobody recorded the year of his death. As one contemporary scientist put it, medical history is full of surprises. Was that experiment enough to convert Sweden's leadership? No. The 5th and final coffee ban lasted until 1822. And after that, coffee was regulated and or taxed in different ways in Sweden until 1951. They've got it all figured out now, though, and they're making up for lost time. Swedes are currently among the highest coffee consumers in the world. And now, I want to wrap things up with one of the all-time greatest quotations about coffee from one of the all-time biggest fans of coffee, Johann Sebastian Bach. He said, "Without my morning coffee, I'm just like a dried-up piece of roast goat." And this is where I'll leave you. Until next time, stay curious and stay caffeinated by whatever beans necessary. This theme song was written and recorded by Clark Blomquist. Bonus fact. I quoted Bach at the end there, but Beethoven was a coffee freak too. He supposedly drank coffee made with exactly 60 coffee beans. Also, he only drank coffee that he prepared himself. Because I guess, how could anybody else be trusted to count all those beans? That's a latte beans to count.